All right, so we're gonna go ahead and work on our actual PCB boards. So you should have a big 3-gallon Ziploc bag that's labeled at the top with PCB. And I'm gonna go over at the beginning what all the contents are for this bag. And we won't open everything at once, but we'll go ahead and solder one bag at a time. But we'll go ahead at least and explain what is in everything. So to start out, you should have a bag that at the very top says touch sensor wire and then 0 ohm resistor. It's also going to be the bag with your big PCB board. It actually doesn't have the touch sensor wire in it, but it has everything else. So we'll go ahead and just talk about what's in this bag. We have our PCB board. There will be a front side and a back side. The front side is the side that will say the Agri underscore ESP32 dev kit 32. That'll be your front side, and we'll go over this later in more detail. And then the back side will be the ones that has more white outlines and text. So we'll go over that later. We'll keep this out for right now. Also inside this bag are some headers. These are your black pieces with pens. You have a 0 ohm resistor. It says 0 on the bottom of it on this piece of paper. You also have 2 diodes that'll have a little bit of red tape on there, and it also is labeled with a D. And these are black pieces with a little tiny silver header, and we'll talk about these later. 220 ohm resistors, you should have 2 of them labeled with 220. So that's everything in this bag, and we're going to start with this bag first, but for right now we'll keep everything inside and go out of the way. So also floating around without a bag are 2 of these they look like PCBs, printed circuit boards as well, but they already have stuff on them. The main one is our microcontroller, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, but this is pretty much the brains of our system. And then we also have an SD module. It's labeled with a little yellow sticker, SD module. And this will be holding our SD cards, which we'll go over in more detail later. You also have banana jacks. It just should be a red and black pair in there. And if you have created your sensors using the male banana jack ends, these are what they will plug into. We also have a touch wire, which we're actually not going to use for this kit anymore, but I'll talk about it later and what its intended purposes are for and what we were going to use it for. Then we have another bag with some smaller components in there. At the top, it's labeled RCA, transistors, and 4-terminal block. So we'll go over the contents of this one real fast. So in there, you'll see a little green block with 4 pins coming out of it. That's 4T block, 4-terminal block. So that will be soldered to our board. We also see transistor, 2 little transistors, and I'll talk about these later. We're gonna solder these on our board, and it's just like a little black half circle piece almost with a straight flat edge, and then 3 pins. And then we have 2 RCA female connectors. And so for our DHT22 sensors, the temperature and humidity sensors, this is what these will plug into. Well, I apologize, not the DHT22. For our radiance sensors will plug into here. So you had soldered your radiance sensors with the male RCA connectors. These are the female connectors. We then have 6 aux sensor terminals. So these are the female jacks for our auxiliary sensors. So for our soil and our temperature humidity sensors, this is what these will plug into, and we'll solder these on the board. So we'll talk about these a little bit later as well. And finally, we have just a typical charging block and a cord wire that'll plug into our actual microcontroller later for programming purposes. So we'll save this for last. We'll come back to this as well. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and solder all the contents of our first bag. And this is the bag that had your PCB board in it. So you can go ahead and take everything out of this bag. Make sure you're working in an area where you're not gonna lose any of these pieces. Some of these components will be really small and they're really easy to lose. So just be very cautious with that. And you can actually use your little cubby holes inside your mat to hold everything in place. Just make sure you don't lose anything. So we're gonna start with our PCB board and we're gonna work with the front side first. So you'll know the front side because I said earlier it has this label for the microcontroller, but I just realized it also is a side that's labeled AgriPV version 2.0, V2.0. So this is the side that's gonna be facing up. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna start with our terminal blocks. So these are gonna get soldered into place and they will allow us to be able to plug in our microcontroller and pull it out and in. And this just in case one of us accidentally blows our microcontroller. It's a very sensitive component. This will give us like a housing to be able to unplug it into. So with the board facing up, AgriPV version 2.0 facing up, we're gonna put these blocks in. And then what we're carefully going to do is kind of hold it down and then turn the board upside down. And we're going to want to sit those down so that way they are holding the board up. And this is a little challenging because you want to make sure both pens stay in there. And if you're able to use the helping hands for this, by all means use them. But for me, I have trouble getting this to stay in there because what we want to do is be able to solder this. So the black pieces, if I show you right here, we don't want to solder them like this, where they're like spread out. We want to solder them very perpendicular with the board. So there's a nice 90-degree angle between the black piece and the board. And so that way we can easily plug in and unplug our microcontroller. If they're to the side like this, wedged out, it's going to be very hard to get to it. So I like to solder it where they're face down. And I usually like to put a little bit of pressure on the board. And then I like to solder the corners real fast just to get it to hold in place. So make sure you have your soldering iron cleaned off. Make sure your smoke ventilator is on, you're wearing your glasses. And what might be able to be helpful for us is if we kind of use our helping hand just to hold this down. And actually, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm just gonna do one leg at a time real fast. So I'm gonna start out with this first leg, this first terminal block, and I'm gonna get my solder and my soldering gun, and I'm just gonna solder a little corner. I'm gonna hold the solder on there, heat the pen up a little bit, and then apply a little bit of solder. And you don't need a whole lot for this because you don't wanna create solder bridges. I'm gonna hold that flat with one finger, and then I'm gonna go ahead and solder on the other side. And so now that side is in. So we're gonna have to solder every pin individually, but I'm just doing that to kind of get it to stay in place. So now I'm looking at the bottom and I'm gonna try to make sure, see how this pin is fairly perpendicular with the board. I'm gonna try to do the same with the other pen now. And this is one of the trickier components that we'll have to do because the angle actually matters. So I'm going to solder the corner of that, hold it down while it cools, and the other corner. So at this point I have 4 corners soldered, and I can now still play with these terminal blocks a little bit to straighten them up. But it's going to at least stay in place. So now I can go through and solder every single pin. So we're going to go through, I'm just going to start at one end and just add a little dab of solder to each little pin. And once you start figuring out your soldering iron and where the hot parts are, you'll be able to do this part much quicker. And notice how I'm not putting too much solder on there. If I put too much solder, what's going to happen is I'm going to create solder bridges and pens are going to start touching each other. And if that does happen, it's okay. We have our solder wick to get rid of that. And that's where this stuff works perfect, on solder bridges in these kind of areas. Okay, so we have one leg in, and I'll try to see if I can give you a closer up view of that. You can see all the little dabs of solder from each pen. And what you're going to want to do before you move on is you just wanted to give a quick little visual inspection and make sure that every hole is kind of covered with solder. If it's not, we may not be having electrical connections, and I can see there's 3 holes down here, 2 towards the top and 1 here where I didn't quite give them enough solder. So I'm going to go ahead and give them a little bit more right here. And remember, with the printed circuit board, our wires that would usually connect components, like when we made our little LEDs and we had wires connecting everything, the wires are internal on the board. And you can sort of see that through these little lines that go through. That's actually copper that's embedded in the board. And so that's why we need to make sure we make good connections to the board so that way they can connect to those wires internally. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second header. And I want to make sure that that header is perpendicular before I start soldering everything in, and make sure that we're not kind of bowed out or bowed in. So now that I got that, I know that's perpendicular. I'm going to continue moving forward and finish these all up. Making sure I add enough solder, but not too much to form bridges. So I don't know if any of you are coffee drinkers, but if you are, I highly recommend not having too much coffee before doing this. I have very jittery hands, and when I have too much coffee, it makes it even harder to solder. Got 3 more pens. All right, so I am done with that piece now. So I'm just gonna give it a quick little visual inspection, make sure each hole has enough solder in it. And everything looks good to me except for the very first hole that I did in the corner. Just add a little bit more to that one. I've also checked to make sure there's no solder bridges, make sure no pins are connecting that shouldn't be. And I think we're good, so we can move forward. So if you wanna do a quick little check, you can take out your microcontroller and you can just try plugging it in. You don't necessarily need to, but at least make sure the holes line up. For me, I can see that I could easily plug this in if I needed to. So I know that the angle that I soldered these are close to 90 degrees, so that's good. So I'm gonna keep that here for right now. We're gonna move on to the next components in our bag. So, wrong bag. So we already opened up our components, so we can do our diodes now. So the diode will have a D. It also should have a side with a little bit of red. And it's a cylindrical object that's completely black. But if you look closely, and I'll try to put this in the light so you can see, there is one little edge with a silver cap, a silver little end. And that's gonna let us know what side our diode needs to go, because the side does matter for these. So what I like to do for the diodes is I like to just kind of fold these. And so that way the wire is going straight up and down. And so that way they can easily plug into where they go on our board. So now we're gonna take our board and we soldered the headers so that way they're on the front part of our board. We're gonna flip it over and go to the back. And you can see over here where we have these 2 kind of holes. Right underneath that, we have 2 squares one's called D2 and one's called D1. That's where our diodes go. And so on here, you can see there's a circle hole and then there's kind of a square hole. You can tell by the plating, the silver that goes around it. It's a square or circle. What we're gonna do is we're gonna stick our diode in with the silver edge pointing towards the square. So you look closely, plugging that in, and the silver side is the same, touching the same side that the square is on. And what I like to do is pull these all the way down to the board, and then I like to kind of fold the pins over underneath. Just like that. And so it's in the board. It doesn't have to be perfect or anything. Notice how mine's kind of like sticking up. That's okay. If you can get it closer to the board, that's better. But it doesn't matter really that much. So I'll just play with this a little bit more, see if I can get it go a little bit more down towards the board. And I folded the pen so that way it at least stays in place for right now. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with both of my diodes. The second one, I'm going to go ahead and bend the legs. And then I'm going to look at my board and see that there's a square hole and a circle hole. The square one is the one that's closer to these two larger holes. And I'm going to stick the diode in with the silver line facing the square hole. I'm going to push that down as close to the board as I can possibly get it. And then I'm going to fold those legs back over underneath the board and get it to hold in place. Now, once those are in, we can go ahead and solder those. So we're soldering these ones from the bottom, or from the top of our board. The diodes are actually on the bottom of our board. And I'm gonna do is just add a dab of solder to each one of those through holes. And once again, we don't need too much. We do want to make sure we close the hole, but if you do have a little bit of extra solder on these ones, there's no components that are too close to it, so it's not that big of a deal. But at least want to make sure the hole is closed. And once we have those soldered in place, what we should be able to do is pull these legs back up. You look on the bottom of our board, you can see these are in place pretty well. They're not moving around, they're soldered in. The solder is filling the holes, so there's no blank space. So now what we can do is we can take our little wire cutters, make sure your safety glasses are on, and just cut the bottom parts of these legs off. And just gives us a nice cleaner bottom. You want to make sure you don't cut the solder part off, so that way it gets dislodged. But now you got those soldered and you're good to go to move on to the next component. Okay, so now that we got our diodes finished, we can move on to our resistors. We have two 220 ohm resistors and one 0 ohm resistor. And a 0 ohm resistor was more or less a placeholder. We weren't sure if we would need a resistance after we measured it. We don't, but we're just putting it in there for right now. So we'll start with that 0 ohm resistor. And once again, we have the bottom of our board, the same side that the diodes went on, facing up. And we'll take that 0 ohm resistor, just like we did with the diodes. We'll pull the edges off, the piece of paper on there, and then we'll just fold these over, just like we did with the diodes. And all I'm doing to fold them over is to make it easier to slide in. And these are gonna go in to our R5. There's a little square on the bottom right-hand corner that's right above the thing labeled float switch. And we're just gonna slide them right into R5, our 0 ohm resistor. We're gonna get that to go in, and then just like we do with the diodes, we're gonna pull that down, get it as close to the board as possible, and then fold those legs over to hold it in place. And just to speed up a little bit, let's go ahead and put our 220 ohm resistors in as well. So you have two of these resistors, pull the paper off the edge. I'm going to fold both of these over once again. And where these are going to go on the board, the same side, we're going to keep our bottom face up. And on the bottom left-hand corner, you're gonna see R3 and R4. And so, see if you can zoom in a little bit for you. So you got R3 and R4, and these are right underneath these little Mickey Mouse looking components and bottom part of our board. So we're gonna slide both of those in place as well. And the nice thing about resistors, at least these ones that we're using, is the polarity doesn't matter, meaning it doesn't matter what pin goes in which. They can go in backwards, they don't really matter. I'm gonna slide these on. And then I'm just folding these legs back. And so real fast, I didn't talk about what these components are actually used for. These diodes, what these are used for is, think about these as like directional valves on a plumbing system. Like, it only lets the water flow in one direction. These pretty much do the same thing with current. They're gonna make sure that our current that's coming in only can flow in one direction. And it won't let it flow backwards. And we put these in here to protect different components to make sure that electricity doesn't destroy them. Our resistors, on the other hand, think about these as more like speed bumps. They're supposed to basically slow down, or not slow down, but reduce the amount of current going to the end of our circuit. And so they're just here to basically protect our circuit, make sure they're not getting too much current. So we got all three of our resistors in there and folded down. So let's go ahead and turn our board back so the front is facing up, and let's go ahead and solder in our three resistors. So once again, you just heat up that hole and you'll add a dab of solder. And so we got 6 holes to fill. And we have those all soldered. So now I'm going to do the same thing I've done with everything I've soldered. I'm just going to look at it real fast, make sure the holes are filled, make sure there's no solder bridges with nearby components. And then once I'm done with that, I'm going to lift all my pins up. And I'm just going to snip these off and give them nice clean ends so our board stays nice and tidy. And we have all of those completed. So now we're done with our first bag. We can go to put that bag to the side. We'll clean up our workstation and we'll move on to our next bag. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and move on to our RCA bag. In this bag, it has our RCA jacks, 2 of them, has our transistors, should be 2 of them, and then it'll also have our 4 terminal blocks. So let's go ahead and open up this bag and put all the components in our little cubby holes. So let's start with our transistors. And so it's labeled the yellow sticker transistor, and if we just take that sticker off and look at them, we see there's 2 components in there. They're semi-circle shaped with a flat edge, and they have 3 wires. So let's take our first one. And if we go to our board and we have the AgriPV version 2 face up, that's our front side. Let's flip that over. So we're on the back side now. And you can see there's 2 components called Q1 and Q2 on our board. And these are the ones that look like little Mickey Mouse holes. This is where our transistor is going to go. And so notice our transistor has a flat edge and then it has a curved round edge. The flat edge is going to go where the flat edge of the white outline is. So our 3 wires are going to have to push into here. So what I like to do is just kind of bend my middle wire just a little bit so it kind of looks like that shape that's on there. And I have very jittery hands, so I'm using my wire cutters just to help me bend that one wire. At least I'm trying to. Okay, so I have those wires sort of bent up to help me push it through the hole. I'm going to put the flat edge towards where the flat part is here. I'm just going to kind of work with those wires and get them to go through the hole. And then once all three are going through, push it down as far as you can to your board. And then we're going to do the same thing with the other one. So I'm going to see if I can do it without straightening that middle wire. So I got the flat edge facing up where the flat edge on our, or the flat white outline is. And I'm putting those three wires in. So you're going to have to move these just a little bit. So this will take a little bit of time, but just be patient with it. Probably could have designed this board with slightly bigger holes to make it easier, but we'll work with what we have. All right, so I got that in there. I got the flat edge facing up. I'm gonna push that down as far as I can. And then what I like to do, just like with the resistors, I like to bend these wires out. Kind of make them stay in place a little bit more. So we should have 2 transistors in there with 3 wires each. We know we got them in the right direction. Let's double check once more, just to make sure that the flat side is facing up towards the diodes. Because this does matter. If we get the wrong pins in there, it won't work properly. And once you got them, I'm going to flip it back so I can go ahead and solder those bottoms. Now this is where it's important for this one. This is probably the toughest component we will have to do, where it's really close to the other pins, and so it'll be easy to make solder bridges. So just make sure you don't apply too much solder. I'm starting off by just re-cleaning off my soldering iron. And come back here. I'm going to go and solder these 6 pins. Now I'm going to create a solder bridge on purpose if I can, to show you or give you a reminder of how to clean that up. So let me see if I just put way too much solder on this one. Boom, so we have our purposefully created solder bridge on this transistor. And you can see where these 2 pins right here touch each other when they're not supposed to. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to grab my solder wick. I'm going to cut off any parts that I've already used with solder already on them. I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm just going to place my solder wick on top of that solder bridge. And I'm going to pull off any of the extra solder that we didn't want. It's also got a little bit on our board. And voila, it is gone. So if you have a mess up, it's not that big of a deal. Your solder wick will help out tremendously. We're gonna put our solder down. We're gonna make sure that these are in place. We're also gonna check to make sure there's no extra solder bridges that we didn't see. Make sure all of our holes are filled. And then after we're done with that, we can go ahead and cut these excess pins off. So if for some reason you accidentally put your transistor in backwards, that's okay. You can, at this point, just use your solder wick and try your best to get as much solder out of the hole so you can remove it. And once you get it removed, you're going to want to spend some time making sure that you get extra solder out of that hole because it'll be hard to push your pen back through. But once you're done, you should be able to see all three of those, and I can kind of see where one of my pens is almost trying to touch the other one, so I'm just going to kind of cut a little bit more of that off. And we have our transistors now soldered in place. So let's go ahead now and let's move to our 4 terminal block. So what this is going to be for, oh, and I guess let me explain these transistors real fast. So transistors act like little switches. And so there's a law called, or a rule called Moore's Law, and it basically talks about how we get more computing power with more transistors, and the idea that if you can create a transistor with half the size, you actually quadruple its power. And so that's the reason why now we have smartwatches, and our phones are virtually just as good as our computers can be, because there's tons and tons of little transistors inside them that you can't even see. This is just a big one that we use for circuits, but our computers are more or less just built with transistors, tons of little switches. So this is just gonna be a little switch in our circuit that's gonna help control when we should pump our water on and off for our irrigation. So now the terminal block, what this is going to be used for is this just going to be a little test point for us. We're going to be able to plug wires in if we want to test our circuits later. And so we have these just going to different pins that we think are important. So with your terminal block, you can see there's going to be 4 little tiny screws at the top. There's going to be 4 pins and 4 little holes. That's for us to shove little wires in and then test them later. But so what we want to do to make sure we can easily access that is first we'll go to our board to see where it's at. If we have the top of our board, AgriPV version 2, face up, this 4-hole square or rectangle in the top left-hand corner next to our big terminal blocks that we put in, our headers. This is where our terminal block is going to go now. But what we want to do is make sure that those holes that we saw where we can plug wires into are facing the outside. So if you look at it, there's also kind of a fat end that comes off. I'm trying to see if I can get this in the camera view for you. This fat end is where it's going to face the outside of our board. So what we're going to do is we're just going to plug that in. And this is where we're going to probably want to get our helping hands to hold it in place. And what I like to do is just kind of hold it at an angle. And just to the point where I can get the header to hold in place without me holding it. So go a little bit less of an angle. And then from here, I'm gonna go ahead and solder from the bottom. Notice how I have it in place, it's touching the board, and now I can try to solder the pins from the bottom. Once I get one pin soldered, then it won't move around as much. So just take your time, make sure it's in place before you go ahead and solder this one. And if you want, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to use my extra side of the helping hands to help hold this in place. Your life will be so much easier if you just take the time and set these things up properly. So yeah, definitely take the extra minute to do this. And this is my first time soldering this board together, so I'm also kind of learning as I go. So now this is going to be tricky, but I'm going to come here and solder from the bottom. I'm going to do the 2 outside pins if possible. Just enough to at least get it to hold in place. And then I should be able to flip it over. Those are in place, good. And now I can solder all 4 pins. So I'll check the 2 that I did already, make sure they have enough solder and these actually look good. Apply some solder to the other 2 pins. Perfect, so those are soldered in place. We soldered from the bottom of our board, but now the terminal block is at the top of our board. and we'll be able to easily plug into those later if we need to. So now we can move on to the last component in this block bag, and these are our RCA male wires. And so this is where our solar radiance sensors will plug in. And what we can do is we take our board and we go to the bottom. We got the bottom where we have our diode, resistors, and transistors showing, and these were where we will plug in these. So what they're going to do is they're going to plug in right down here where we have SIS2 and SIS1. That's solar irradiance sensor 1, solar irradiance sensor 2. And for these ones, you can see how your prongs, you have 3 prongs, 2 on the perimeter and then 1 in the middle. And notice how the one in the middle, it's slightly raised above the other 2. So it's not directly centered between the other 2, but it's slightly raised in this direction. And so it's raised in this direction. And so notice our holes in the board, we have 2 right next to each other, or 2 that are parallel with one another and 1 that's slightly offset. That's how we're going to put these in. So you line up all the holes, and then these kind of like pop in just a little bit. They sort of hold in place a little bit for you. So I'll do that with the other one, and I'll look at this one and see that that center pin is slightly misaligned up in this view. So now I'm going to plug this in where the center pin is slightly misaligned on the board. And you got both of those in place. One of mine fits in really snug where it actually doesn't move while I have it in the board. The other one wobbles around a little bit. That's fine because we're going to solder it. So what I like to do is just turn those over upside down. Make sure they're still flush with my board. And then we're going to solder those 6 pins in. And these are going to be slightly bigger holes, so they might take a little bit more solder, but we still don't need too much. What I'm doing is I'm heating the hole in the pen, and then I'm adding the solder to it. So that way it's already hot before I get there. So heating the hole and the pen, and now I'm adding the solder. Just doing that for all 6 pins. I hope you all are finding this a little bit easier than doing the sensors. The sensors are hard because you're not soldering to a fixed object, where the board makes it a little bit easier, in my opinion at least. So I can see where there's a lot of holes left open from ones I've already soldered. So I'm going to add a little bit more. So now that I have that all in there, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at each one and make sure that they are flush with the board, which they are. They might be a little warm. And I'm checking the bottoms, make sure that there's no solder bridges, making sure they're all soldered completely, look like they are. So I'm going to cut these prongs off a little bit. And don't cut too far, you just need just a little bit taken off. And make sure you have your glasses on. And I got those all cut off. I didn't cut too far so that way they fall out. And we are good to go. So we are finished with that bag. So in that bag we had finished soldering our transistors, our RCA male terminal blocks, and our little 4-pin terminal block or header that we can plug into to test the board. So we'll go ahead and clean up our workstation and move on to the next bag. Okay, we're gonna move on to our aux sensor terminal bag. So if you open this up and dump out the contents, there should be 6 of these terminal blocks. And I think these are one of the easiest things to solder. So we start out with 1, and we look at the bottom of our board, the same side that we have our RCA connectors on. And you can see where there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parts on the board that are made for these sensors to plug into. And they are labeled SMS1, SMS2, SMS3, SMS4. These are for our soil moisture sensors. And then these two are labeled DHT22.1, DHT22.2. And these are for our DHT22 sensors, obviously, our temperature and humidity sensors. So if you were to look at this aux sensor from the top, and the screw portion at the top, that's where our aux sensor will plug into. If you look at it, it almost looks like a perfect square, except one corner is kind of chiseled off. So you get a slanted corner. If you look at our board, you can see the white outline has almost a square on 3 sides, and then one corner is like slightly chiseled off. That tells us how these plug in. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna plug in one of these in each part of the board. And what I like to kind of do is just start out with 2 of them in different parts, different sides of the board. So I'm doing one in this corner and then one in this corner. And I'm making sure that that slanted part lines up directly with the white outline underneath. So I'm going to do one more quick double check before. I got the slanted piece up here, slanted outline on the board, and then slanted piece here, slanted outline on the board. And now once I have those 2 in place, I'm just going to flip it over. And I did 2 in opposite corners so that way they can kind of act like table legs, holding each other down. And I'm still going to have to help balance them a little bit. But then what I'm going to do is just apply the soldering iron one edge to help kind of balance it. And I'm just going to add some solder. Once again, if you want to take the time and use your helping hands instead of trying to balance it, that's perfectly fine. For me, I just find this a little bit easier. So I'm just kind of doing 1 pen to kind of hold it in place. I'm going to move over here and do 1 pen over here. So before I solder any more of the other pens, I just want to make sure that those are pushed down as far as they can go, which they are. They're not perfectly secured because I only did 1 of their pens, but they're pushed down, they're still good. They're not like hanging off in a wrong direction, so that's good. So I'm going to flip this back over. I'm kind of using another sensor just to help prop it up. And I'm going to go ahead and solder the rest of those pens. Some of these pens are smaller with less air or less hole in between, so you don't need as much solder, but some of these pens, like the one I'm doing right now, is definitely much larger and it's going to require more solder. So I got that whole one done, and I'm going to do the other 4 pens over here. And this is one of the ones with the big holes, so it's taking a lot more solder. Perfect, so I'm going to check all my holes, make sure they're all full. This one needs a little bit more. Just make sure we're getting good connection everywhere. And good. So now we got 2 of those 6. And I'm just going to go ahead and do one more quick little test to make sure they're snug and tight. They are. So we got one done and another done. This way. So let's go ahead and put in another sensor. Once again, I'm looking at the slanted corner, which is down here by my thumb. And the slanted corner on the board is right here. So I'm going to go ahead and plug that in. Turn it upside down. And then we're going to go ahead and solder this one into place. I'm being careful that my soldering iron is not getting too close to this header right here, because I don't want to melt the plastic on that header. So I was being very careful that I'm only touching things that I want to touch. Take your time and got that one all soldered up. I'm gonna head check that one real fast before I move on. It looks like all the pins are soldered in. There's no air spots that I can see through. And I got the alignment correct. It's nice and snug, so let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Once again, slanted corners down here by my thumb. There's a slanted corner right here. Plug that in, and I'm gonna see if I can cheat and plug in two at the same time on this one. Slanted corner, slanted corner. The alignment does matter with these, so definitely make sure that you're taking the time to check to make sure they're in the right spots. I got those both plugged in, and now it's kind of sitting nice and flat for me now that I have more of these in here. So let me go ahead and solder all of these through. I'm heating up the pen and the outline circle a little bit before I'm applying the solder. You don't need to heat it too long, just for like a second or so. Help it warm up. And the last pen on this one. And these ones are a little bit tricky because they're getting close to this plastic piece, so I'm keeping my soldering iron very far away from it. Just making sure I have enough solder for each hole. All right, I got both of those finished up. Take a look at them, make sure they're not missing anything. They're all in there, they're nice and snug. Perfect, and we got one last one left. So once again, the slanted corner, I'm putting it in the hole with the slanted outline, flipping it over, and we're going to solder the last one. Perfect. So I'm going to take a little look. They're all soldered through, they're all filled. All 6 of these are nice and snug. And now if you look at the bottom of our PCB board with it face up, you can see we got our 6 aux sensors and all the other components that we've soldered thus far. So we can go ahead and clean this up, and then we'll be able to move on to the next bag. Okay, so we're going to move on to our SD module. And so this is something that was probably not wrapped in a bag. It's by itself. It's labeled at the bottom with a sticker, SD module, a yellow sticker. We pull it out. It looks like its own little PCB block. And it has these little other things that are already soldered on there for us. It's got these pins that kind of come in at a 90-degree angle. And it also has a spot for us to fit a micro SD card. So what we will be able to do with this is we're going to program our microcontroller with that once it collects all the data coming to the board, it'll store it inside an SD card here, where then we can take that SD card out and collect the data. So if you look at this, we're going to look at the top of our board. We know at the top it's labeled AgriPV version 2.0. It's got our terminal blocks already in, our headers, and then our 4-pin terminal block already in. And we're going to take our SD module card and we're going to plug it into this top corner over here that's labeled SD card J14. And what we want to do is when we plug this in, we want to make sure that the part of our SD card where it's got all the stuff on the front of this PCB is facing the board. We don't want to put it in backwards like this. And in fact, it'll actually be kind of hard to put it in backwards because it's terminal block. We're going to want to put it in just like this. And this is the one that you're probably going to need your helping hands for. But I'm going to see basically if I can stick it up like this. And then I'm going to use my helping hands almost like a platform to hold my board up. Because I want this piece to be relatively flush to the board if I can be. So hold this down a little bit more. Notice how I kind of got that stuck up. The SD card's pretty close to the board. If I look at it from the bottom, it's up near like a 90-degree angle. If I can get it to stay in place. Take your time. Okay, so now that I got that kind of where I want it, I'm gonna go ahead and grab my soldering iron. And this is one that we're gonna get cautious with because there's a lot of pins that are relatively close. And I'm just gonna go ahead and solder my outside corners first. And the reason why I'm doing this, just the outside corners, is I want to make sure that that SD card is facing the board in the way I want. I want to make sure that it's facing straight up and down and is not lopsided all the way out like this or too far inward. I want to make sure it's nice and flush kind of with the board with 90-degree angle the best I can. It looks like we did a good job on that. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it back over and I'm going to solder the rest of those pins. And we got those all soldered. I'm going to want to look at this and make sure that all of the holes are filled. Make sure there's no solder bridges formed. If there are, you can use the wick and solder wick and get rid of them. And it all looks good to me, so we're going to go ahead and move on to our banana jacks now. So with our banana jacks, we're not actually going to have to do any soldering for these. And this is what we're going to use to get power from our 12-volt battery to this board. And you have a red and black banana jack in here. And you're going to see a bunch of little screws on the bottom. So we're just going to start out and we're going to do our black one first. And so on our board on the bottom side, next to our 4 soil sensors, and actually let me face it the way you've had it earlier, we have this little spot up here for our banana jack, these 2 big holes. And so what we're going to want to do is, if we start with our black for our negative, that's the one that's going to go closest to our 4 soil sensors. So what we're going to do is we're just going to unscrew the 2 little nuts that are on there. Make sure that they drop down in one of our little compartments so we don't lose them. And then there's also going to be a little washer and then a little piece with kind of like a tail end. We're not going to use that piece for right now, so we can get rid of that and move it to the side for now. But what we're going to do is we're going to take our little washer and we're going to slide that back on. We're going to slide one of our nuts on. So in reality, we only have to take 1 nut off, but we wanted to get rid of this piece anyway, so we had to take both off. We're going to slide that back on. Then we're going to put this through our board, and then we're going to slide the other nut on the bottom. Oops. And so when you tighten it up, you're going to go clockwise to tighten it up. And all we're going to do is get that really nice and snug against the board, tighten it finger tight the best you can. And we have the nuts are actually electrically conductive as well, so they'll still be able to travel or send the signal through, and they're making contact with this silver little outline. And so that's why we don't need a solder. We can let the nuts do the solder work for us. So we're gonna do the same thing with our red one. We're gonna unscrew both of the nuts. We're gonna get rid of that little tail piece that we don't need. And that's in case we did want to solder a wire to this later. So the way that would work is we'd be able to slide this over our nut or over our screw part and then solder a wire to this little hole. But we're not gonna worry about that for right now. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and actually let's do the nut first. I did that backwards, so I'll fix the black one. We're gonna slide the nut on. We're gonna put the washer back on. We're gonna put this into place. And then we're gonna put this nut back on the other side. Let me try to. I'm gonna hand tighten that the best I can. Clockwise to tighten and counterclockwise to loosen. And I'm just gonna go ahead and fix this one up real fast since I did that backwards. The black one, I want the little washer piece to be touching the board. It's just gonna make a little bit better contact for us. So washer first. I'm gonna tighten that up all the way up to the black plastic piece. Then my nut, or my washer. I'm gonna put that into the board. And then I'm gonna go ahead and tighten the nut on the bottom of that screw. Ideally, we'd have multiple washers, but it didn't come with all of them, so we'll be fine with what we have. We're gonna hand tighten. We got them both nice and snug in there. And you can see our red one is closest in the corner. Our black one is gonna be closer to the 4 soil sensors. And we have pretty much completed everything for this board. So I'll go quick ones through for all the components that we have not done. So we talked about the touch wire. And ideally what we were gonna use the touch wire for is if we go back to the front of our board, there's this little tiny square in there. And we were gonna solder a wire to this little square, and it was gonna be able to be like a touch switch for us. We could turn it on and off just by touching the wire. We're still gonna add this later, but you can see the wire that I gave you for this is way too thick to go through there. So we're gonna have to do different wires. You can also see there's a button down here, and that's gonna be able to turn the internet on, so we can collect data through internet instead of through the SD card as an option later. But we're gonna solder this ourselves later. And then the only other components missing are a float switch. And I'll talk about this in the system overview, but for the float switch, all that really is it's gonna be a switch to turn on and off our pumps if our water tank gets empty. So if our tank is empty, it'll make sure the pumps don't go on, and so that way we don't destroy the pumps. And then we also need to solder up our pumps, which we'll do later as well. Outside of that, I think we finished this board. The very last thing that we can do now that we're done with everything is we can plug our microcontroller in place. So you should have a microcontroller. You can see where it has a little power input where it looks like an old phone connector. And that's gonna go onto the top of our board. And these are gonna plug right in. So we wanna make sure that before we plug these in, we have this piece of our microcontroller sticking out of the board. And we're plugging it in into our headers the only way that we allowed it to with the AgriPV version 2.0 up. So we plug those in. And what you want to do is kind of just line up your wires or your pens before you plug them in. You don't want to bend these pens up, and it looks like mine's already bent up a little bit. But you want to make sure they all line up before plugging it down. And then push them down evenly on both sides, get a nice snug connection, and our microcontroller is in place. So we could have easily soldered our microcontroller to the board, but if we end up blowing our microcontroller, we need to change it out, then we have to desolder everything. So by putting these little headers in, we allowed us to just be able to plug this in, plug it, take it out if we need to. Makes it a lot easier to work with. And the very last thing we'll have is our charger and our charging block. And you should be able to test this out, and this should be able to plug in directly into the microcontroller, and that's how we'll connect to our computer later to program these. And we can also plug this into our system, into our inverter afterwards with this block to give it power once we are finished with our programming. But for right now, let's go ahead and just take this wire and our plug, and we'll put it back into the bag, and we'll put it to the side for when we get up to our programming session. So that is the end of our PCB board, and let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for following.